Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 Wealth Talks, a series of exclusive lectures organized by Santander Private Banking to provide you, our clients, with expert opinion on issues that in one way or another may have an impact on your investment strategies. Let me start with the logistics. Although I am sure we're all quite used to Zoom by now, the talk will be in English, but you can listen to it in Spanish by pressing the interpretation button in the Zoom menu and selecting Spanish. La charla será en inglés, pero puede escucharse en español pulsando el botón de interpretación del menú de Zoom y eligiendo español. This Wealth Talk is on Zoom to allow live questions at the end. Until that time, your micros and cameras will be disabled. If you want to submit a question during the talk, you can do it by sending it via the chat to the presenter, and I will give you additional information about how to ask questions in due course after the talk is done. And to safeguard the privacy of participating clients, the question and answers will not be included in the recording of the event. That will be available in our web in a few days. Today, we are joined by geopolitical expert Matthew Goodwin, who some of you may remember since he was with us last June, accompanied on this occasion by economic expert Greene. Our colleague Juan de Dios Sánchez Rosselli, Head of Global Investment Strategy at Santander Private Banking, will address the questions we all have about American politics, the new Europe, Brexit, and the vaccination process. Juan de, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Cristina. Good afternoon or good morning if you are attending from the Americas. Thanks for taking some time off your busy schedule, and thank you so much for your trust in our financial advice. My name is Juan de Dios Sánchez, and my role in this talk is as moderator. We have two experts that will provide us with insights about the post-COVID, post-Trump, post-Brexit world, just to name a few of the historic events that have impacted recently. Our first guest is Greene. She's Senior Fellow of the Harvard Kennedy School and Chatham House, and she's a very influential economist and regular columnist at the Financial Times. Welcome, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You're now based in Boston, and a lot of things have been going on recently in the U.S. Give us a 2-minute summary on the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration.
Yeah, so first I'll say what everybody's talking about today in the U.S. And for the past week in the U.S. is GameStop, a video gaming company that's seen its equities absolutely soar off the back of retail investors deciding to squeeze short sellers. And so it does speak to kind of a new market structure in the US. And I doubt this is a one-off. We've seen it happen with a few other equities since. But generally, the big issue in the US is what the new administration is going to achieve. They've announced a huge fiscal stimulus that may or may not get through. I'm sure we'll have a chance to discuss that over the course of the next hour. There are questions about U.S.-China relations as well, how U.S. foreign policy will change with a completely new administration, and what the post-Trump era looks like.
Okay, so we started the year with a lot of events in the U.S. We have the Capitol insurrection, the Reddit revolution, a lot of things to discuss. Our second guest is Matthew Goodwin. Matthew is a very well-known academic and a regular commentator on global geopolitics. He's the author of the Sunday Times bestseller, National Populism. Matthew, it is great to have you again in one of our Wealth Talks. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you for having me.
Could you provide us also with a 2-minute introduction on recent events in Europe and how we've started this new relationship between the UK and the European Union?
Well, yes, indeed. And if I could extend the warm welcome to everybody and say good morning and good afternoon from London, otherwise known as Brexit Britain, where we are currently debating what our future relationship with the European Union is really going to look like, and also whether President Biden is going to be looking to London for that historic relationship, or whether he's going to be looking at Brussels and the European Union for a new relationship. And I think there is a sense of unease here in the UK about what our role is in international relations, and whether we might find ourselves squeezed between the European Union on one side and the United States on the other. But if I could go back 12 months in time, I would certainly have bought stock in GameStop, in Zoom, and in Tesla. Those are maybe the three things I would have done a year ago as I listen to Megan and think if I could only travel back in time.
Oh, we would have done many things. Okay, let me start with a brief introduction on the format of our discussion. During the next 40 minutes, we will discuss 4 major topics about that are very relevant to financial markets. And we have selected those 4 topics because they relate to the central scenario that we have of a recently published market outlook. We thought it would be of interest to our clients to dig inside the main assumptions with your insights and be able to confront your views about what we thought could be the most likely scenario for 2021. The report is called Recovery and Disruption. And if you still have not received a copy, please ask your advisor or banker for one copy. You know, our thesis for 2021 in this report was that we were going to have a solid economic recovery based on the combined effect of vaccine immunization and economic stimulus. However, there are potential areas of disruption, and as a result of the secondary effects of the financial medicine that has been administered to the global economy. So we will discuss about these 4 major hypotheses. But without any further ado, let's start to ask questions and challenge the scenario with both Megan and Matthew. And let's start with the first one. We talked about in the report about the economic recovery in 2021. And the recovery is, we mentioned that it's a V-shape, but V-shape not because it's very strong, but it's very dependent on vaccines. The vaccine rollout is one of the single most important factor in the recovery equation, and vaccines are going to really shape the recovery. Matthew, you are an expert in nationalism and geopolitics. Please give us your view on vaccine nationalism and how we are collaborating on this effort, how the world is emerging from this pandemic shock.
Thank you for the question. My first broad point is that we should not lose sight of the remarkable achievements that have been made so far. And it is remarkable that within 1 year of coronavirus, we have developed multiple effective vaccines that can effectively treat coronavirus. As of today, we are just about to hit 100 million first doses of the vaccine globally. But of course, underneath that, it is clear that we are suffering from some serious problems in the vaccine rollout. And if you look at the very latest data compiled by some of my academic colleagues at the University of Oxford, they suggest that there is a wide variation in the ability of different countries currently to administer vaccines, ranging from 54 doses per 100 in Israel, down to 9 doses per 100 in the United States. And we've seen some specific problems currently and over the last few days within the Eurozone and within the European Union. We have Italy on 3 doses per 100, Spain on 3 doses, Germany on just under 3, and France on 2. So these vaccine rollout difficulties, I think, are very serious. We've seen the World Health Organization warn countries over the last week against export bans on vaccines. We have seen AstraZeneca reach a new deal with the European Union to increase the number of vaccines by 30% to provide 9 million extra doses. But we've also seen this emergence of vaccine nationalism rather than vaccine cooperation. So I think we really need to think about how 3 things are going to affect the global recovery. The first is those logistical problems related to the rollout of the vaccines. And I think those will get dealt with quickly, and they are being dealt with currently. For example, AstraZeneca is going to roll out production across the European Union very quickly. But secondly, I think we're going to have potentially a problem around geopolitics and ongoing disputes about who is getting a vaccine and who isn't. And I think thirdly, we're going to potentially have a problem with a reluctant population, a reluctance among voters to be immunized, to take the vaccines. And in the surveys, we can still see significant levels of hesitancy, particularly in countries like France, not so much in countries like Spain and Italy, but we can see, large numbers of people saying that they are unwilling to take the vaccine. And if you look at the World Bank forecast for the global economic recovery, the World Bank has global GDP growing by 4% this year, but that assumes that we make rapid progress with the vaccines throughout advanced economies. The downside scenario, if we do not achieve that vaccine rollout, is global growth of around 2%, which is the downside scenario. So I think, the broad picture is still positive. We have effective vaccines. We know the vaccines work. We know the cases are coming down. Here in the UK today, we've got new evidence that the vaccines are working, and our cases are down 30% on last week, and our death rates are down 5% on last week, all because of the vaccines. But we really need to iron out these vaccine rollout problems in order to meet those best case scenarios.
So you're in the UK we're paying a lot of attention to the UK as they are much farther ahead, and the positive news that you have given us, support this scenario of the effectiveness of vaccines and hopefully a successful vaccine rollout during 2021. Megan, let's change subject and go fiscal, and let's talk about economic stimulus. Your FT column is a source of wisdom about judging how policy response has been done during 2020, and I would like to ask you about how the response has compared to the previous crisis. Did we learn the lessons of the 2007 financial crisis? Have we done better?
Yeah, thank you. I remember a colleague saying to me last April, so when we knew about this virus, we just didn't know how long it would last or what the implications would be. But we were talking about a policy response, and he said, thank God we had the global financial crisis. And I never thought I would be grateful for the global financial crisis. But there were quite a few lessons that we did actually learn. First of all, I'd start with the central banks. And this particularly goes for the Fed, but also applies to other major central banks. They stepped in really quickly and boldly. The amount of ground that the Federal Reserve covered in just a couple of months to go from their position that they didn't want to pick winners and losers, they could never buy up corporate debt, for example, to essentially backstopping the entire market and encouraging the bull market that we now see is huge. A few months before this virus hit, I sat at a Fed conference and asked about buying corporate debt, and they all looked at me like I had 40 heads. It was just completely not on the table, but sure enough, a couple of months later, they were buying not only corporate debt, but high yield as well. So I think that central banks moved really quickly, and that was a lesson we learned after the global financial crisis, because they knew they needed to restore market functioning immediately, or the hole that we were digging for ourselves would be much bigger. So the Fed was really proactive, and that was a big lesson. I also think on the fiscal side that Congress in the US acted really boldly, really quickly as well. So the CARES Act was $2 trillion in spending. It's the biggest fiscal package we've ever had. And if you had told me that we would manage to get kind of bipartisan agreement on such a big package so quickly a few months prior to the crisis, I would have said, no way, this country's so divided, there's no chance. And sure enough, we did. I think we also targeted the funding a little bit better this time around, in that after the global financial crisis, there was really this sentiment that we had bailed out Wall Street, but we hadn't bailed out Main Street. And I think we got that balance a bit better this time around, particularly in the US. We came up with a PPP program to support small and medium-sized businesses. We beefed up unemployment insurance pretty significantly. We mailed out checks. Now, those measures actually expired over the summer and weren't re-upped until December. So I think that might be a sneak preview of what might eventually come ahead. So have we learned the lessons? It's too early to say fully, but I do worry that we might end up having fiscal fatigue set in earlier than it should in the US. Now there's a big spending plan on the table that Biden's proposed, and they're negotiating it now. But I do think what we saw after 2008 was that the Obama folks passed as much as they could get passed immediately, and then they knew it wasn't enough and figured they would do more later. And by the time later came, there just wasn't enough political capital left to pass things. And I worry that that might happen not just in the US, but also in Europe, in China as well. So in the US, we might get fiscal fatigue. In Europe, all the fiscal rules have been suspended for this year and probably will be suspended for next year as well. But as we come out of this crisis, the Northern European countries are probably going to be doing better than the peripheral countries that are more reliant on things like tourism. So you could see the Northern European countries saying, why are we suspending these rules anymore? Things are back to normal. Just because it's back to normal for them, not for the entire region. And in China, we're already seeing a withdrawal of accommodation because China actually is the only G20 country that managed to grow last year. And so we're seeing fiscal measures pulled back and also monetary policy pulled back. And it's hard to do that with real precision. So there is a chance that you could get overshooting. So I think we learned a lot of lessons from the last crisis, but I do worry that maybe we haven't learned them all. One other thing I might mention is that all of these decisions in terms of fiscal stimulus are political decisions. And there's a way to get away from that with automatic stabilizers. So to choose a trigger that turns these programs on and then also turns them off. And there's a lot of talk about beefing up automatic stabilizers so that we don't have to wait for politicians to agree on this stuff. But so far, not very much has been done. And so if we don't manage to do that, that will be a missed lesson from the last crisis.
So you have to put a grade on the fiscal response on the monetary side and the fiscal side. What grade would you give?
So I think the monetary policy response, if the goal was to get the markets to function again, I would give it an A+. If the goal was to address inequality, I would give it a much lower grade. But, I think their job was for the markets to work again, and they managed to step in and deal with that pretty quickly. On the fiscal side, the jury's really still out. So far, I think we've done a pretty good job. I would give us maybe an A- because they're in the US, we haven't had enough funding for state and local governments. There hasn't been enough funding for the actual vaccine distribution or testing and tracing. And until you get that under control, you're going to have to re-up every other fiscal stimulus measure because, as you pointed out at the beginning, the virus is dictating everything about this downturn and also the recovery. So there were some missed tricks, but I also think, it's a bit too early to give out a final grade because there are more rounds of stimulus coming.
Okay, so in terms of the economic recovery, I think we have, some very positive news flow from in these few weeks of 2021 regarding both vaccine effectiveness and also about, fiscal stimulus continue to be supporting the economic recovery. But let's turn to the second hypothesis in our annual outlook, which was the view that 2021 could be more favorable in terms of geopolitical noise. The past years have been very difficult with strong disagreements inside the European Union and between China and the US with regards to trade and tariffs. Let's start with Europe. Matthew, how good is the Brexit agreement? Has Europe avoided the worst case scenario? And how have we been doing in the last weeks regarding interpreting the Brexit agreement?
Yeah, well, I think we'll be talking about Brexit still for some time to come. The most fundamental point about Brexit that I think everybody outside of Britain really needs to know is that Brexit was really never about the economy. Brexit was always about politics. And because it was driven by politics, it meant that the most economically optimal scenarios were never really going to happen. The United Kingdom was never going to stay within the European Economic Area. It was never going to continue with freedom of movement. The reality of Brexit is that it dictated that we had to leave the single market and the customs union. So once you get to that position, as we did and as we all saw, then you realize that the choice for Europe was essentially a no-deal Brexit, which would have been incredibly disruptive, or a basic free trade agreement Brexit, which is essentially what we got. And so that basic FTA is the best deal that I think we all could have got, given the politics. It covers the economic and social partnership. It gives us a framework for cooperation between law enforcement and the courts. And it gives us an arrangement for governance, which will allow us to negotiate and compromise on the economic relationship going forward. And alongside that, we've got a number of joint declarations that cover things, or at least provide the foundation to discuss things like financial services, subsidy control, asylum, and the UK's participation in various EU programs. But if you look at some of the forecasts about how Brexit is going to impact on the UK economy, some estimates by some colleagues of mine at the London School of Economics suggest that over the next 15 years, the free trade agreement between the UK and the EU could reduce UK GDP by 4%, which is greater, they estimate, than the fiscal impact of the coronavirus crisis. Now, take that with a pinch of salt, because it's a long period of time and there's a lot of things that can change, vaccines being one of them. But there is clearly a consensus among economists that this is going to be an economically damaging exercise for the UK. Now, if you look at the other side, and we've got some recent research, a new survey of EU and American economists, about 86% believe that the UK economy will be several points smaller in 2030 than it otherwise would have been. The way in which Boris Johnson is going to try and navigate that is by essentially diverging from the European Union as much as possible. And we've already seen over the last 2 weeks government plans to try and deregulate around workers' rights and the Working Time Directive, which the government has just been forced to deny. But what I'm seeing in London is a Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, who is clearly committed to now diverging from the European model in any way that he can, to try and deliver what he calls global Britain, which is still not very well defined, and to try and make the most out of this new strategic autonomy that the UK has. We will work together. We'll have a future relationship together. There's no doubt about that. We're too close not to do that. But I think the political effects of Brexit, the economic effects, will continue to be with us for many years to come.
Okay, so we have a complex new relationship, and certainly is we have less noise in the short term, but we have a potential negative consequences as a result of the Brexit. All the agreement. No, let's change the focus to the U.S. and its relationship with China. Megan, they are battling these two economies for global supremacy, and it's hard to believe that things can get worse than they did with Donald Trump. Tweeting negative messages to Xi Jinping one day out, every day, single day. Joe Biden, the initial messages seem to be also tough on China. How do you think is going to be the relationship under the Joe Biden administration?
Yeah, so I think that the nature of the relationship will feel different, particularly for American companies, but the actual goal will remain the same. So fundamentally, Donald Trump's Make America Great Again strategy and Biden's Buy American strategy they're essentially getting at the same thing, which is that it's unfair that Chinese companies have forced technology transfers, government subsidies, and so the US has to stand up against that. That's what's at the heart of both of them. Now, Biden's Buy American industrial policy will be carried out very differently from Trump's China policy. So Trump relied on tariffs, unilateral tariffs. He was obsessed with bilateral trade balances. The Biden folks won't be interested in bilateral trade balances, and rightly so. That was sort of economically illiterate to be focusing specifically on that. But the Biden administration will also be tough. So I think the tariffs that have already been implemented, those will stay unless the US can extract concessions from China in exchange for removing them. That being said, I don't think we'll see foreign policy by tariff played out by the Biden administration. Instead, the Biden folks will reach out to our traditional allies and we'll try to work through multilateralism. But like I said, for US companies, they might notice that this strategy is all put in much cuddlier language by the Biden administration than it was for the Trump administration. For foreign companies, though, I think it will roughly feel the same. Whatever the language, the strategy won't change much. And so I think for Chinese companies in particular, not a whole lot in practice will change off the back of this. And I find international audiences are always really disappointed to hear me say this. We won't see President Biden be conducting foreign policy by Twitter. So, those kinds of differences will certainly exist and the approach will be different and more inclusive and cooperative. But the goals are the same. And so I think conditions will still be pretty tough. I think those tensions will persist. Fundamentally, what's at stake here is who's going to be the biggest economy in the world. And neither China nor the US has any incentive to back down. I'll leave it there.
Okay, so we have more or less a similar situation, less noise in the short term, but there are several serious confrontation and areas of dispute between these two global leaders of the economy and geopolitics. Let's turn to another important aspect of our cautiously optimistic view of markets and the economy, which is fiscal stimulus. The recovery is very heavily supported by both monetary and fiscal policies, and there is a consensus about economic organizations, academia, and politicians that the recovery needs to be supported yet. The politicians have been given the license to spend, and nobody mentions the word austerity so far. Yeah? But this consensus can be challenged, and we expect some challenges in the future. Let's start with Europe, where fiscal policy is always more complicated because of the supranational consideration of having a single currency. Politics in Europe is always complicated, Matthew, but Europeans have enjoyed the comfort of, since 2005, that Angela Merkel was there to infuse some common sense and German logic to any negotiation. How is going to be life without Angela Merkel going forward after September? How are we going to cooperate without her?
Well, I think this is the question.
Creo que esa es la pregunta más importante para Europa en 2021. Las elecciones de Alemania es el momento más importante, por lo menos en mi calendario, al pensar en Europa. Y no nos olvidemos que van a ser seguidas por las elecciones presidenciales de Francia en 2022. O sea que son dos momentos importantísimos para el liderazgo europeo y se van a producir en medio de muchísimos desafíos. Muchas personas que asisten a esta conferencia serán conscientes de que hay disputas económicas muy importantes entre
states that are struggling, and I'm anxious that the coronavirus crisis will exacerbate the divergence between the states. And Angela Merkel was central to smoothing some of that tension, as well as the tension between East and West over rule of law issues. And she was central to the delivery of the stimulus last year. So I think overall, this is going to be a seismic moment for the continent. We've also got big elections in the Netherlands, regional elections in France, and we've got a government crisis in Italy, which again underline the need for competent and coherent leadership. My prediction is that Merkel will be followed in September by a black-green coalition, by a conservative-green coalition, which I think would be good for Germany and for Europe in the long term. I think it would see a continuation of Merkel's policies. I don't think we will see a radical departure from the Merkel model. Even the individuals who have been chosen to succeed Merkel have remained broadly attached to her philosophy. There are some warning signs that we should take seriously. There is a big faction within the conservative element in Germany that argues that Merkel was too centrist, and they want to see tougher positions on refugees, and they want to see a tougher position on the financial settlement at the heart of the Eurozone. And I think some of that might be exacerbated by Macron. Macron is weakened currently by the response to coronavirus. And we had an opinion poll this week that put Marine Le Pen on 48% and Macron on 52%. And that is the highest level of support that we have seen for Marine Le Pen in history, in any opinion poll. And of course, the election is next year, but I think it is to be taken quite seriously. And more generally, we know that Merkel brought not only the funding settlement, the Hamiltonian moment in Europe, the 750 billion euro recovery fund, but we also know that she played a big role in concluding the trade agreement with the UK and also the investment deal with China, both of which have, I think, lay a foundation for the European Union to enter into a new era of relations with both of those powers. The question is whether the next German Chancellor is going to be able to really exploit that potential. The risk for Europe is that with those tensions in German politics, that leader may be distracted, may have to focus a bit more on internal relations than Europe. And that may be magnified by Macron having to focus for the next 6 months on his big battle with Marine Le Pen, on the 6 months to a year. And you might have seen that today, one of the things that Macron is introducing are some tough new restrictions to clamp down on terrorism and security challenges in French society. And the other thing, just to keep in the back of your mind, is that when it comes to the economy, the centre-right in Germany and the Greens have never governed together before. This will be the first real test for this new alliance if it comes together. And that too, I think, may be a really important moment for Europe and how we hopefully begin to smooth these relations between North and South.
Thank you, Matthew. You've explained very well the very difficult task of the shifting equilibrium of power inside Europe after Merkel. Nobody could have done it better in just 5 minutes. Megan, let's focus now on the equilibrium of power in the US. In the last 2 years, Republicans have lost control of the Congress, of the presidency, and now the Senate after the result of the runoff elections in Georgia. Could you give us some insights about whether the Biden administration has enough leverage to approve all the economic priorities of its agenda?
Yeah, gladly. Now, in addition to the $2 trillion CARES Act that I mentioned that was passed earlier last year, in December, the government passed $900 billion in stimulus measures. And now President Biden has proposed a $1.9 trillion stimulus. And so the question is, will he manage to get any of that or any of his other plans through? This $1.9 trillion stimulus is the first half, essentially, in what Biden wants to pass this year. The second half, in some ways, is the much more important piece. That's the Build Back Better program that will involve kind of a medium to longer term outlook to try to have an infrastructure spending program, address inequality, boost worker power, things like that. But that will come with a huge envelope as well. So what will the Biden administration manage to achieve? I think a lot will come down to what legislative process they decide to use. President Biden has come in promising to be a president who will unite the country. And so accordingly, he's hoping to negotiate with the Republicans and get enough Republican senators in particular on side so that he can get 60 votes to pass this program. So far, that's not looking very likely. In fact, just yesterday, the Republicans came back with a counter proposal for a $600 billion stimulus instead of the $1.9 trillion that Biden had proposed. They'll sit down and speak tonight. There's no way that the Democrats will accept this counter proposal, but it might be the starting point for negotiations. The problem with going through kind of a reach across the aisle approach is that it takes time, and Biden has put a real focus on getting something done. It needs to be big and it needs to be fast. That's what the two priorities for the Democrats are. And so there's another option, which is to go through what's called the reconciliation process and kind of shove these measures in alongside a budget. Now the Democrats can use two reconciliation processes this year because the Trump folks didn't actually pass a budget last year. So they could go ahead and do that, and that would mean they only need a simple majority in Senate to pass it. The Democrats have a simple majority and no more. And so what that would require still is for the Democrats to remain incredibly united and to all vote in favor for this package. Now, first of all, it's possible that not all the measures that Biden wants to pass technically qualify for reconciliation. And so later this week, the Biden administration will sit down with the Senate parliamentarian. The Senate parliamentarian will be the one who decides whether these measures actually qualify. But that's more of kind of a suggestion than actual law. The Democrats can still go ahead, and even if the parliamentarian says these don't qualify, they can pass those measures through reconciliation. It's a bit of a nuclear option, but it's still technically possible. In doing that, though, the Democrats might alienate some of their own, so some of the more moderate Democrats, in which case they won't manage to get all of the Democrats on board to pass the reconciliation measures, and then it would fail. So I think what we'll see is that this bill will inevitably be stripped down from the $1.9 trillion. It's just unclear exactly how much it will be stripped down. And I will say for market participants, I think it's a consensus view that we won't get $1.9 trillion in measures, but we'll get a bit less than that. But it's consensus that we'll get a big stimulus. What isn't consensus at all is that we might also get some tax reforms alongside that. So we might get a hike in income taxes for the top bracket, a corporate tax hike, and that will have implications for company earnings and therefore market moves as well. So I think the stimulus side is priced in. I think the tax reform side is not priced in at all. And there's probably an underappreciation among market participants that some of that will also get passed. And so I think that's worth keeping in mind. And then, like I said, after this, we go in a few months' time. I think we can expect this stimulus to be passed by the end of March. And then the Biden administration will turn its focus to the Build Back Better program, which in some ways is bigger. And we'll have to see how much political capital is really left to go ahead and go big on another spending program. There are already rumblings, even among some of Biden's own administration, that $1.9 trillion is just too big a stimulus program. Usually when you come up with a stimulus program, you figure out how big the hole is that you've gotten yourselves into. You figure out what the multipliers are on different programs, and you kind of try to fill in the hole. And this time around, almost all economists will accept that we're throwing more money into this hole than the hole is deep. So we're projecting that we'll spend more than we actually lost in this crisis. And so some economists have said, well, we might overheat the economy. I'm actually not worried about that at all. And I would say the strategy isn't to specifically target the money so that we just fill in all the losses. The idea is that so many businesses and individuals are suffering that to reach them, we're going to have to overspend a bit. You can't be so specifically, perfectly targeted. You just have to get money out and hope it gets to the people who need it. And if some goes to others, then, oh well. The risk of doing too much is far smaller than the risk of doing too little.
That's certainly the view of Janet Yellen, no, in her recent comments, and even if the Biden stimulus plan is trimmed down to $1 trillion, if we add that to the $900 billion that was approved under Donald Trump, that's nearly 10% of the GDP. So we are really close to overspending more than underspending. No? So that's that's a very good explanation, Megan, about the dynamics of how things get approved in Washington, which is also tricky. Thank you so much. Let's go to the final part of the discussion, and then we go through the Q&A session, and we have some questions that have already arrived. The last part is about populism and inequality. Matthew, you recently wrote about populism losing support after COVID-19. The question is whether populism is really finished or whether it's only a pause.
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the big lessons from the 2010s was that we have to take populist parties very seriously, and that they have become a fairly stable presence on the political landscape. We've since had the US presidential election, where, of course, we saw Donald Trump leave the White House, albeit reluctantly. But at the same time, we saw Donald Trump attract 12 million more votes than he did 4 years ago, and also broaden his base. And Trump did better among some non-white groups than he did in 2016. Here in Europe, we've just had a recent study of how all of the populist parties have been doing across the continent, and it found that actually only around half of them lost support during the first phase of the crisis, from last March to June, that about 5 of them increased support, and 10 saw no change at all in their support. So the picture basically was quite mixed. And you can see that when you look at the latest opinion polls, and I spend a lot of my time looking at what's going on in Europe. You can see people like Matteo Salvini struggling in Italy, but you can see the Brothers of Italy doing much better. You can see parties like Chega in Portugal doing reasonably well, but you can see other parties like the Alternative for Germany struggling in the polls. So I think the picture has been quite mixed. The big 2 tests for this movement will obviously be the German elections and the French elections, as I've mentioned. But I think what's also important for people on the call to remember here is that a lot of evidence that we now have about how this crisis is changing our societies would certainly suggest that it is sharpening the drivers of populism that lie underneath the surface. We've got work from the IMF, and we've got work from academics, which shows quite clearly that past pandemics increase inequality in society. They lead to a significant increase in the Gini coefficient that measures inequality. And remember, those pandemics were smaller than the one that we've got at the moment. But also, secondly, we've got work that shows that this crisis currently is exacerbating the divides between highly educated groups and university educated people, the middle class, the wealthy, and it is hitting low income working class voters not only harder economically, but also in terms of the health effects. And so the discussion that we've had globally about the so-called K-shaped recovery, I think is something that we will continue to have going forward. Just one final statistic to leave with people on the call. Some colleagues of mine just finished a survey, a global survey, and they asked people lots of questions about institutions and media. And they found that globally, 67% of people now say that the media can no longer be trusted to be objective and to be independent. So it's not simply that we're losing support for our political institutions in some countries, but I think we're losing trust in the ability of the media to accurately report on some of these issues. And I think that's just as important as some of the political issues that we talk about. So populism, I think, unfortunately, I think is here to stay through the 2020s.
Okay, and let's link this discussion about populism to inequality. Megan, you have expressed concern about the rise in inequality and the need to reduce the gap between Wall Street and Main Street. How do you see this problem after the effects of the pandemic?
Yeah, so I think inequality has been sort of turbocharged by this crisis, and we saw it when we were all locked down, and it was those hourly service workers who were holding our economies together, who were delivering our groceries and removing our garbage, but they weren't being paid accordingly, right? They were absolute heroes, but were making sort of minimum wage or slightly above. And so at least there's more awareness now that this is an issue, and I think it's gotten worse over the course of this pandemic. And I will say it's worse in the US than it is in any other developed country. I'm writing a book on inequality now. I desperately did not want to write a book about the US, but unfortunately it's so turbocharged in the US, it's hard to avoid. But I will say there are some things that we could do and that the Biden administration is actually focusing on to address inequality. One is, as you look outside, or as I look outside, there are all these small mom and pop shops that are boarded up now, but it's the Starbucks, the big superstar companies who have access to capital markets who have managed to survive in this crisis so far. And so what you see is that you get an increase in concentration in a number of industries, which has been a long-standing trend in the US. It's just been really turbocharged by this coronavirus crisis. And what happens when you get superstar firms is that you end up having, a handful of companies dominate an industry. So if you're a worker who works in that industry, you only have a handful of potential employers. And so if you're looking to change jobs, you might get an offer from another employer, but they know very well that you don't have that many options. And so your chances of negotiating for a higher wage or better benefits are really low. You don't have much worker power. And so one thing we could do in the US is to beef up antitrust. And we're starting to see that certainly in the tech sector. With more discussion about regulation, but it's not just tech, it's retail and healthcare in particular as well. So that's one way to address inequality. I would say another thing is in the US, union membership has fallen really significantly over the past couple of decades. And on top of that, firms have actively discouraged unionization. And have managed to classify workers as contractors instead of full-time workers so that they don't have to pay them benefits or give them a steady contract or a fundamental multi-year gig. And so that also decreases worker power pretty significantly. And so as part of the Build Back Better campaign, the Biden administration is hoping to encourage unionization, punish companies that are misclassifying workers, and that are undermining unionization. So that's something else we can do too. And then on the tax front, you could have a more progressive tax structure. Now the extreme of that is a wealth tax, which I don't think makes any sense. It's incredibly expensive to administer, and so doesn't tend to generate that much in revenues. So it hardly seems worth it. But you could increase taxes for the upper echelons of US society and decrease them for the lower echelons. And if you compare kind of tax brackets and effective tax collection for the US and other developed countries, the US has a pretty regressive tax system. So you could make it more progressive and look at redistribution of wealth as well. And then I will say, as an economist, the gold standard for us is GDP growth. That heals all wounds. It's what we all care about. Policymakers are all trying to maximize GDP growth. But ultimately, what does GDP actually reflect? Not much. I mean, if you're an economy with incredibly expensive healthcare and you count prostitution and drugs in your GDP calculations, and you have a really big financial services sector that's massively overblown, you'll have a lot of GDP growth. Is that a good thing? I would argue it's not. And it completely ignores the distributional effects of GDP. And so I think having a government that actually cares about the distribution also makes a difference. And I think that this administration, the Biden administration, if you just look at who they've hired in economics, it's a lot of domestic labor market economists, which shows that they really care about this issue and plan on prioritizing it, and that should make a difference as well.
Thank you, Megan. So summarizing what we have discussed, in the short term, probably we see the economic recovery playing out because of the vaccine effectiveness and the continuation of the stimulus programs, and less geopolitical noise, so that also is positive. But for the medium term, we have some significant challenges in terms of populism, in terms of fiscal fatigue, in terms of the inflationary consequences of these new monetary policies, and about the relationship, the difficult relationship between China, the US, and the UK and Europe. So that's probably a brief summary of what we have discussed, but now we have the opportunity to ask questions to Megan and Matthew. I have received one question about the equilibrium of power in the US. Probably, Megan, this is for you. The question is that the Republican Party seems to have doubled down in its support for Donald Trump, does not appear ready to reject the narrative that the election was stolen. How does this bode for the political outlook in the US? And can the Biden administration work with a Trump-led party that denied his legitimacy? Can we rule out further political violence? What is your view?
Yeah, thanks. I think one of the most interesting political questions in the US is what direction does the Republican Party go in from here? The fact that the Republican Party isn't wholeheartedly rejecting the notion that the election was unfair, I don't think that matters. There's little question at this point that the election results are what they are and can't be contested, and that's it. But I think, unless Trump is impeached, which is a possibility, but not a slam dunk, there is a possibility that Trump could he could come back. Even if he doesn't come back as a candidate in 2024 in his own right, I think he'll remain a force behind the Republican Party. He's shown that already in his meetings with McCarthy and McConnell. And so I think we can expect his brand of populism to persist. I also think there's a younger, in many ways, far more clever host of Republicans who are coming up. And I think that, they're the likes of Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz. And so I think they've been watching what Trump has done, and they're planning on adapting it for their own candidacy. And so I think that's also a possibility for 2024. There's one other possibility, which is that the younger Trumps decide that they would like to run in 2024. There's a lot of talk about Ivanka Trump, for example, getting into politics immediately now that she's moving to Florida. Could she be a candidate in 2024, or Jared, or Donald Trump Jr.? It's a possibility. I think it's probably the least likely of those scenarios, but can the Biden folks work with Republicans, if any of these scenarios come through? And I would say that President Biden, as vice president and in his long career in politics, has a history of reaching across the aisle. So if anyone can manage to come up with some kind of agreements within an incredibly divided political system, then I think President Biden has pretty good prospects. But we're already seeing in these negotiations about a fiscal package that will be the priority initially for him. But if it takes too long and it doesn't seem like the votes are there, the Democrats will shift pretty quickly and use the reconciliation process to try to kind of bypass any Republican pushback on what they're trying to do. And so unfortunately, I just think, the two parties are so far apart. The Biden folks are the best you could hope for in terms of trying to reach across the aisle, but it might still not be possible.
Cristina, remind us about the possibility of participating directly in the Q&A session.
Yes, of course. If you want to ask questions, you can do it through the chat by sending them to presenter, which is me. And if you want to do it live to the speakers, just use the raise hand button that you might find either under reactions or within the participants menu, depending on your version of Zoom. And when it's your turn, I will give you the floor and you'll be able to activate your microphone and your camera if you wish in order to ask your questions, okay? So let's move on to the next questions. I guess we've got a couple of ones, Juan.
Yes, I have a question for Matthew. It's a question from our customer in Mexico about the potential relationship with the Biden administration with Europe, the transatlantic relationship. How do you see this evolving in the next 4 years?
Well, I think it's a great question. Clearly, Biden brings a very different outlook to the table. He is a multilateralist. He believes in the liberal world order. He believes in working together around institutions. He's already committed the United States back to joining the Paris climate agreement. He's made it clear that he wants to work with the European Union on issues around China, around net zero targets, on climate. And of course, all of this has left number 10 Downing Street and Boris Johnson feeling a little bit anxious because there are people within the Biden White House, including Biden himself, who have said that they think, quote, unquote, that Brexit is a historic mistake. And they view this as being something that is somewhat similar to Donald Trump. They view it in the same mindset that Brexit is populism, which is Trump. So there is a nervousness in London about what this means. And if you remember Winston Churchill's famous description of the true power of the United Kingdom, he said its strength really comes from being at the center of three interlocking circles. It stood in the Commonwealth, it stood in the English-speaking world with America and Canada, but it was also next to Europe. And of course, Tony Blair also argued that the UK was the bridge between the United States and the European Union. But Biden brings a very different outlook, and I think the first test of this will be at the climate summit in Glasgow, the COP26 summit later this year, when I think many people in British politics will be looking anxiously at how that relationship evolves. And I think also we are still waiting to see what Boris Johnson's vision of global Britain is going to be. Is it a low tax, low regulation economy that is the so-called Singapore on Thames? Or is it going to be an economy that broadly remains committed to European standards, European regulations around things like state aid and workers' rights and all of these kinds of things? So I think Biden's administration is raising a lot of questions for the European Union, but it's raising a lot of questions as well here for Boris Johnson and number 10.
Thank you, Matthew. So we wanted to finish with British punctuality. So we have many questions, but we only have time for two of them. They are both relation to the economy. So Megan, you have the last slot to answer two questions. One is relating to advanced economy keeping on spending on levels higher than they criticized for the developing countries a few years ago. So, and another question is in relation to the effects on inflation of all this, fiscal stimulus. Can you give a summary of your view on these two topics, which are related?
Yeah, sure. In terms of kind of all this deficit spending and what happens to debt levels when the developed world was criticizing a number of developing but also peripheral European countries for borrowing on this scale, the thinking in economics around debt have changed pretty fundamentally and fairly recently. So traditionally, we look at debt to GDP as one measure of kind of fiscal sustainability. But debt is a stock and GDP is a flow. And in economics, you never look at stocks to flows. You're supposed to look at stocks to stocks or flows to flows. And if you actually go ahead and do that, if you use a flow to a flow, so if you look at debt servicing costs to GDP, they've come down really significantly since the global financial crisis even. And that's for the US, but also even for peripheral Europe, for much of the developed world, and also parts of the developing world. So emerging markets have managed to issue a significant amount of debt in the past year, partly because of this massive wave of liquidity that the Fed and other central banks have pushed out. So as long as that tide of liquidity doesn't recede, I think this game can keep going on. When it does recede, that could be a real problem for emerging markets and also for peripheral Europe, I think. I think the US is in a different sort of category because it has a global reserve currency. There's an endless appetite for US treasuries. And so I'm not worried that the US is about to get pushed into any kind of investor strike, given that it's racked up so much debt so quickly, even if borrowing costs start to rise a bit. And that kind of gets at the second part of your question, which is what happens if we provide all this spending? What happens to inflation? And if you learned economics 50 years ago, you would have learned that all this fiscal stimulus would absolutely result in an acceleration of inflation traditionally. That's what economic theory would have taught you. I would argue that, first of all, we will get an acceleration of inflation, no question, this spring, because it will be the year-on-year comparison with a year ago. And a year ago, we locked down our economies, so prices fell significantly. And so that means come April, May, we'll see a huge acceleration of inflation just because it's compared with quite a depressed period. And so that will distort inflation. I think we should look right through that. We'll also see some inflation as we open back up in industries with supply shortages. And so you'll see some inflation then. Again, I think we should look through that as well. The question is, do we have fundamental new inflation? And there I'm really skeptical because there are a whole bunch of new structural drivers that make inflation, sustained inflation, difficult to generate. So the gig economy, technological advancement, even though we're rolling back on globalization, I think these other things will probably offset that as an inflationary impulse. Also, inflation is much more a global phenomenon now than a domestic one. So, we import inflationary or deflationary pressures pretty significantly too. So it's not just what's going on in the US, for example, it's what's going on everywhere else in the world. And the long run neutral rate is global, and it's really hard for a country or its central bank to diverge from that. And that long run neutral rate is really low, which suggests that inflation will be low as well. And then finally, this inequality piece that I've talked about really exacerbates the global glut of savings, and that's what's fundamentally behind the whole secular stagnation theory. So there will continue to be an excess of savings over investment, and it will be really difficult to generate inflation in that environment. So I will die on this hill. I don't think we're going to get sustained significant inflation. And even if we did, I think central banks have recognized they've missed their inflation targets for over a decade now. They're going to have to see inflation overshooting to offset that. And it's now been baked into the Fed's mandate, might be as well when the ECB comes up with their new monetary policy strategy when they're done with their review this year. And so central banks, even if we get some inflation, I think they'll sit and wait before they feel any real need to respond to that by hiking rates and pushing borrowing costs up higher. So I'm not particularly worried about that.
Thank you, Megan. Well, certainly we are in a changing world, and conversations like this are, great to have insights about, new ways that we have to adapt our previous thinking about the economy, about geopolitics. So for me, it has been a very interesting conversation. I hope it has been also very useful for our clients, and thank you very much for participating in this Wealth Talk. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.